3406E, we are changing the O-rings on the oil cooler because it is leaking coolant, and it seems to happen very frequently. When it gets cold, they'll start leaking, and then it'll be fine for a little bit, but it just continues to get worse to a point where it'll leak out all your coolant over the weekend. And so we got to change that. I'm not sure if that happens on only the 3406s because we have a B model that I did this to a couple years ago. But this is how we're going to do it. I know the 3406B is a bit different in how the cooling system is set up, but it's really quite a straightforward process and pretty easy. So we are up underneath the truck now, and right there is the front of the oil cooler, and that is where it always starts leaking when it gets cold, and then it doesn't really ever get better. It gets better when it warms up a bit, so we're gonna pop that front horn off and change the O-rings. It is a pretty simple task as long as you can get those two bolts out, but that is the oil cooler horn. We're gonna undo those front bolts and then slide out the piece of the front there. And inside there's another piece with two O-rings on it. That's what we're gonna change. I know on the B models, it has a crossover pipe that goes up to the front, so you need a few more gaskets and stuff, but it's very much doable without taking a lot apart. We're gonna start off by draining the coolant, and then we're gonna remove some of the air piping, and we'll move some of the wiring and stuff just to give us a bit better access, but we could do a lot without taking much apart. We're gonna do a bit to make it a bit easier, but it's not a huge job, so let's start draining the coolant. Well, that one came free. Aha. Got everything disconnected. Let's try and... Oh, there we go. Still a little bit of coolant in there. Try and collect it all. We're not going to save this stuff because it's going to be all contaminated and yucky. It's definitely interesting how they have this all kind of set up, because the back one is just one full piece with one O-ring, and the front one is the front housing, the oil cooler, and then a sleeve with two O-rings in it in between holding it together. So now we got to try and get it apart. Well, I thought for sure you could remove this horn without taking the back of the water pump off or removing the oil cooler, but I am stumped. It is so close, like millimeters away, but I just can't get it out. Unfortunately, I've tried everything I can. I can't get that front oil cooler horn off without removing more, so we're gonna start pulling the oil cooler off. We're gonna remove the back horn, get that pulled off, clean things up really well in there, and then we're gonna unbolt the oil filter base from the bottom of the oil cooler and start pulling it off from there. I unfortunately didn't buy all the parts that I needed to do that much on the oil cooler, because I know on our B model I didn't have to do any of that. I just got the horn off on the front. So we'll get this ready to pull. The parts place is closed today, so we'll get parts tomorrow and finish it up tomorrow. Okay, we got it all cleaned up the best we can. So now we are going to start with the back housing on this oil cooler. We're gonna remove those 4 bolts, get this piece pulled out that way, and then we're gonna pull the 4 bolts that bolt the oil filter base onto this oil cooler, and then everything should just slide out the back like that, and it should be clean enough that I won't drop anything in there, and we'll quickly plug those holes once we get it off. Now we're pulling the bolts out of the bottom of the oil cooler. There we go. There's 2 on the front of the base here, and then there's another 2 at the back, and they seem to be coming pretty easily. Okay, so we've got it all disconnected, and I can move this oil cooler around a bit. So let's get this horn off. This is the whole reason we're doing it, so we can change the 2 O-rings on here. So now we'll get this out of the way, and now we can get that oil cooler pulled, and then we'll just start cleaning. I'm trying to do this carefully so we're not disturbing anything and putting debris into the oil, because now we've got 2 open holes. So there's the oil cooler. I should keep an eye, make sure I know which the front is. And there's our 2 oil O-rings in the back or on the bottom. We're gonna get new ones for those. Let's get this thing set down and cleaned up. Seems like every time you pull an oil cooler off, you're always finding little pieces of rubber in there from who knows what. But we will just blow it out, make sure that it's all clear, and then we'll start cleaning up all the mating surfaces. I got all my parts cleaned up nicely. We wire wheeled all the bolts, cleaned them up. We cleaned up the inside of all these lips to make sure there was no O-ring left on them. And then to get these lands out and cleaned up where the O-rings sit, I just took a piece of emery cloth like this and ripped it into small little pieces, and then just went back and forth in here. Worked really well. So now we will go and clean up the truck, the block, get that all ready for tomorrow when we get parts. So I scraped off the gasket that was on there and that was on here, and now I've just got a little Scotch spray pad on my die grinder, and we'll just give it a quick buff. These things work really good for cleaning up gasket surfaces. We're back working on the cooler. Day 2, I got all the parts. They're laid out here. Everything is cleaned up and ready to go, so we're gonna start installing it. We're not doing a full reseal, so we didn't get the kit, but we got our gaskets for the coolant side, our O-rings for the coolant side, and then our O-rings for the oil filter base that go on the bottom of the oil cooler. We got a little bit of oil here. We're gonna lube up our O-rings, slip the front housing on, and then get that placed with the O-rings also for the oil cooler, and then we'll get the back housing on after because we can do it later. We've got everything on here in place. Bolts are all in there loosely, and now we're gonna tighten those 4 at the same time as the 4 on the oil cooler, a little bit on each one, just so that it all stays lined up nicely while it's going together. And then we will worry about the front later because it's less important with the double O-ring in there. It'll stay better aligned and sealed. We've got all the back bolts on that rear housing tightened up and the oil filter base tightened up to the oil cooler. So now we're gonna work on this front section, just the 2 bolts on that housing with this gasket. And then from there, we're gonna start putting some wiring back together, and we'll put the turbo back together, all that. Okay, so the oil cooler is complete. It's all buttoned up and everything that has to do with that is done. So now we're gonna put the piping on. We got the intake and the intercooler piping, and then there is a wire back here for that sensor that is pretty bad, so I'm gonna see if I can fix that up. And then we have to attach the block heater cord back onto the heater element in this hood. So I thought going into this job on the 3406E, you could do just the front O-rings on that cooler without removing the cooler, but I was wrong. On the B model, you can do it without removing the cooler. And on the C15, C16, C18, they have a redesigned front hood with 1 O-ring in it. And then again, you can do it without removing the cooler. But on this one specifically, you have to remove the cooler to change those front O-rings. And it's a really common leak when it gets cold. For the most part, we deal with it. It's not a big deal. But then it gets to a point where this thing's leaking out all the coolant in 2-3 days. That's unrealistic to deal with, and then it makes the truck unusable in winter. So when it gets to that point, you kind of got to bite the bullet and change it. While I was in here, I did some heater hose lines because I had the coolant out already, and they were degrading from all the oil that was on them for the last 15 years. So this thing is going to be ready to go in the next hour, I'm sure. It's all topped up with coolant. We put everything back together that we needed to, and so now we're going to fire this thing up, put it outside, and we're going to run it for a while, make sure we don't have any leaks, and make sure that we don't have any air in the coolant system. It's outside now. We got the high idle on, and we're going to let it run with the rad cap off.
Make sure our fluid's going down. Our hoses are warming up, which is good. So it should be circulating, and we'll just check in a little bit if we got a leak. Took it for a spin around the block. It all seems to be doing well, and there's no leaks at the oil cooler. So I think that is a job well done, and it just sucks that we couldn't do it without pulling the whole cooler. But hey, you live and learn. So that is how you do O-rings on a 3406E oil cooler.